before Columbus, before the Norse settlements of the North Atlantic, before any European ship had crossed the Western Ocean, a city was already standing on the eastern shore of what is now Lake Michigan. Not a village, not a seasonal camp, not a temporary gathering place for seasonal ritual, not a site occupied for a few generations and then moved on from. A city, in the full sense of the word, a permanent, densely occupied, hierarchically organized urban community that persisted in one place for more than 3 centuries at its height and that left in the earth beneath the American bottom a material record of extraordinary depth and complexity. A city, with a population that some estimates place at 10 to 20,000 people at its height, organized across a landscape of earthen mounds, plazas, wooden buildings, and agricultural fields that extended across the river bottomlands of what is now the state of Illinois. The city is called Cahokia. It was one of the largest pre-Columbian urban settlements north of the Rio Grande, and it was doing things that our usual understanding of ancient North America had not prepared us to expect. The central monument of Cahokia is a structure known today as Monk's Mound, an enormous earthen platform 100 meters wide at its peak, 300 meters long, and 30 meters high. It is among the largest pre-Columbian earthworks in North America. The volume of earth contained within it is comparable to or exceeds that of the Great Pyramid of Giza by some estimates. It was built by hand, without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals, by workers who carried the earth one basketful at a time from borrow pits located in and around the city, and who built it up over multiple construction phases that spanned several generations. The people who built it are not named in any written record. They left no inscriptions, no codices, no administrative documents. The civilization of Cahokia existed entirely before the literacy that would have preserved its history in the form we most easily recognize, and the accounts that European colonizers eventually wrote about the Mississippi Valley describe a landscape that had already been transformed by the epidemics and the political disruptions that preceded sustained European contact. The city that had once stood on the American bottom had been abandoned for several centuries before the first European travelers arrived to record what they found. This is the ancient American city that most people have never heard of. And the more archaeologists study it, the stranger and more significant it becomes. Cahokia challenges the story most people carry about ancient North America. The standard version of that story treats the indigenous peoples north of Mexico as living in small, relatively mobile communities, organized around hunting, gathering, and in some regions horticulture, without the dense urban populations, the monumental architecture, and the complex political hierarchies that characterized the great civilizations of Mesoamerica and the Andes. This version is not entirely wrong. Many indigenous North American communities did live in relatively small, dispersed groups. But it is incomplete in ways that the evidence from Cahokia and from other Mississippian sites makes clear. The Mississippian cultural tradition, of which Cahokia was the most spectacular expression, developed across the eastern woodlands of North America from roughly 800 CE onward and persisted in various forms until the disruptions of the colonial period. It was characterized by intensive maize agriculture, platform mound construction, complex social hierarchies, long-distance exchange networks, and the development of large, densely populated regional centers that served as political and ceremonial capitals for the surrounding territories. Cahokia was the largest of these centers, but it was not the only one. Dozens of other Mississippian towns and cities existed across the region, from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, from the Mississippi Valley to the Appalachian foothills. The existence of Cahokia does not require revision of the recognition that many indigenous North American communities were organized differently from the urban civilizations of Mesoamerica. It requires something more specific: the recognition that indigenous North America was not culturally uniform, that the range of social forms and organizational scales it contained was wider than the standard narrative acknowledges, and that the urban tradition of the Mississippian world was a genuine and significant achievement that deserves to be understood on its own terms rather than as a lesser version of developments that happened elsewhere. The name Cahokia, incidentally, does not come from the people who built the city. This is itself a symptom of the broader problem of how Cahokia is remembered, or rather how it is not remembered. The city that was home to tens of thousands of people at the height of its occupation does not even carry the name that its builders gave it. That name has been lost entirely, along with the language in which it was spoken and the oral traditions that would have preserved the community's understanding of its own history. It comes from a later indigenous group, the Cahokia, a sub-tribe of the Illinois Confederacy, who lived in the region when French explorers arrived in the 17th century, long after the original city had been abandoned. The actual name that the city's builders used for their home, and the language in which it was spoken, is unknown. The landscape of the American Bottom is one of the most ecologically productive in North America. The American Bottom is the name given to the floodplain of the Mississippi River in southwestern Illinois, a broad, flat valley between the bluffs of the river to the west and the upland ridges to the east, periodically flooded by the spring floods of the Mississippi and its tributaries and enriched by the silt those floods deposited. In the period before intensive European-American agricultural development, the American Bottom was a mosaic of forest, wetland, prairie, and river margin habitats that supported an extraordinary density and diversity of plant and animal life. The Mississippi itself and its tributary streams were full of fish. The wetlands produced waterfowl in enormous seasonal concentrations. The forests and prairies supported deer, turkey, and other game. The floodplain soils, repeatedly enriched by flood deposits, were among the most fertile agricultural soils on the continent. The people who founded Cahokia around 1050 CE, or who transformed an existing smaller settlement into the city that would become the largest urban center north of Mexico, chose their location well. The American Bottom was not a desert to be overcome or a hostile environment to be mastered. It was a place of genuine abundance, and the city that grew there was, in part, a product of the specific productivity of that landscape. The Cahokia site itself occupies a slight rise in the floodplain, elevated just enough above the normal flood level to provide a stable foundation for the earthen mounds and the wooden buildings that constituted the city's built environment. The surrounding landscape was altered significantly by the construction of the city. Borrow pits excavated to provide the earth for the mounds left distinctive depressions in the landscape. Agricultural fields were cleared and maintained on the floodplain and on the upland terraces above it, and the hydrology of the area was modified by the construction of wooden palisades, causeways, and water management features that controlled the flow of water through the inhabited areas. The bluffs that rise above the floodplain on the eastern side of the site provided stone, clay, and other raw materials. The specific combination of resources available within a reasonable distance of the Cahokia site, floodplain soils for agriculture, river resources for protein, upland forest for timber and game, and clay-rich bluff deposits for ceramics and construction, made the American Bottom one of the most ecologically advantageous locations for a large, permanent settlement in the eastern half of North America. The founders of Cahokia, whoever they were and whatever process brought them to this specific location, chose well. That were not available on the flat bottomland itself, and the upland forest above the bluffs was a source of timber, game, and plant foods that complemented the resources of the lowland environment. The Cahokia community occupied a position that gave it access to multiple ecological zones within a relatively small geographic area, and this diversity of resources was part of what made the location capable of supporting a population of the scale that Cahokia achieved at its peak. The history of how Cahokia was discovered, studied, and interpreted by European-American scholarship is a story with some uncomfortable dimensions. The mounds of the American Bottom were visible to the first European travelers who crossed the region in the 17th and 18th centuries, and their scale was not lost on early observers. But the prevailing assumption of European American scholars and commentators through the 18th and 19th centuries was that the indigenous peoples they observed in North America were not capable of having built structures of this kind. The result was a prolonged debate about the identity of the mound builders, as the hypothetical civilization responsible for the earthworks was called, in which the actual indigenous peoples of the region were effectively excluded from consideration as the builders of the monuments that stood in their own ancestral territory. The mound builder myth, in its various forms, proposed that the earthworks had been created by a lost race. Phoenicians, Israelites, Vikings, Welsh colonists, Egyptians, or the survivors of various other distant civilizations were all proposed at different times as the builders of the North American mounds. This myth served ideological functions that are not difficult to identify in retrospect. By attributing the mounds to an extinct or displaced non-indigenous population, it removed the evidence of indigenous cultural achievement from the landscape and made the territory available, conceptually, for European colonization without the acknowledgement that a sophisticated indigenous civilization had once occupied it. The myth was effectively refuted by the scientific work of the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology in the late 19th century, whose systematic study of the mounds and their contents established beyond reasonable doubt that they had been built by the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of the region. But the broader cultural impact of a century of mound builder mythology, the displacement of indigenous achievement from public consciousness and from popular historical narratives, has proved more durable than the myth itself. Systematic archaeological investigation of the Cahokia site began in earnest in the 20th century, and the pace of discovery has accelerated significantly in the past 3 decades as new methods have been applied to the evidence. The site is not fully excavated, and a substantial portion of what lies beneath the surface of the Cahokia landscape remains undisturbed, available to future researchers with methods and questions that have not yet been developed. The mounds themselves are largely unexcavated. Monk's Mound has been the subject of limited archaeological investigation, but most of its interior remains intact, preserving within its earth the construction sequence and the associated deposits that would allow a much more detailed understanding of the mound's development and use. And the picture that has emerged from that investigation is considerably more detailed and more impressive than anything the 19th century debates could have produced. The site is now a UNESCO World Heritage Property and an Illinois State Historic Site, and it is the subject of ongoing archaeological research that continues to refine and in some cases revise the understanding of what Cahokia was and how it functioned. The physical layout of Cahokia was organized around a hierarchy of mounds and plazas that expressed, in spatial terms, the social and political organization of the community. The site covers an area of roughly 15 square kilometers in its full extent, though the densely occupied core of the city was considerably smaller. The central precinct of the city was defined by a large wooden palisade, a defensive or ceremonial enclosure of upright wooden posts that surrounded the main mound group and the Grand Plaza, separating the core of the city from the surrounding residential and agricultural areas. This palisade was rebuilt at least 4 times during the city's occupation, a significant labor investment that speaks to the importance of the enclosure as a feature of the urban landscape. Within the palisade, the Grand Plaza was a large, leveled open space roughly 300 meters wide and 500 meters long, oriented on a north-south axis. The leveling of this area, which required the removal of existing topographic variation across a substantial surface, was a significant earth-moving project in its own right. The plaza served as a public space for the ceremonial and social activities that required large gatherings of people, and its orientation and dimensions suggest that it was designed with specific astronomical and ritual considerations in mind. Monk's Mound dominates the northern edge of the Grand Plaza, its flat summit platform rising above the surrounding landscape in a way that would have been visible from considerable distances across the flat American bottom. The mound was built in multiple construction phases, beginning in the 10th century and continuing through the 12th, with each new phase adding material to the top and sides of the existing structure. The summit of the mound supported one or more large wooden buildings, the largest of which, based on the post holes preserved in the mound's surface, measured approximately 30 by 15 meters. This building was almost certainly the residence or ceremonial space of the most senior authority figure in the city, and its elevated position on the summit of the largest earthwork in North America made the relationship between authority and height unmistakably clear. The surrounding landscape contained more than 100 additional mounds, and the full spatial extent of the city, including its residential areas, its agricultural zones, and its satellite communities in the surrounding uplands, has only recently been appreciated through the application of LiDAR remote sensing technology, which can detect subtle topographic features invisible to ground-level observation. The picture of Cahokia that LiDAR analysis is producing is considerably larger and more complex than the picture that conventional survey methods had established, and it suggests that the city's reach into the surrounding landscape was more extensive than earlier researchers had recognized. Of various sizes and configurations, arranged in groups that archaeologists have interpreted as the centers of distinct residential and ceremonial neighborhoods, each organized around its own smaller mound and plaza, each replicating at a smaller scale the spatial logic of the central precinct. Movement through Cahokia was organized by the spatial logic of the mound and plaza system in ways that structured the experience of daily life and the performance of public ritual. The most prominent paths through the city connected the major mound groups to each other and to the central precinct, following routes that were probably elevated causeways or maintained surfaces across the flood-prone bottomland. The organization of these routes around the mounds and their associated plazas created a series of thresholds and transitions in the urban landscape, each movement from one precinct to another involving a crossing of some kind of defined boundary, a passage through a gateway or around the base of a mound, that would have been spatially and probably ritually significant. The Grand Plaza was accessible from multiple directions, but the main approach from the south involved crossing a large, low mound, sometimes called a round top, that served as a kind of formal entrance to the plaza space. This sequence of approach, threshold crossing, and arrival in an open ceremonial space is a spatial structure that appears in many ancient urban contexts and that is generally understood to serve purposes of social and ritual conditioning, preparing the person who undergoes it for the activities that occur in the space beyond. The wooden palisade that enclosed the central precinct was not simply a defensive feature. Its gateways were points of controlled access to the core of the city, places where the flow of people into and out of the central precinct could be managed and where the transition between the ordinary residential space of the city and the more symbolically charged space of the central mound group could be marked by a specific physical experience. The palisade separated the space of authority and ceremony from the space of everyday life, creating a distinction that would have been visible, tangible, and meaningful to everyone who lived in or visited the city. The wood hinges, circular arrangements of upright wooden posts, are one of the most evocative features of the Cahokia landscape, and their discovery in the 1960s was one of the more significant advances in the understanding of the site's cosmological and ritual dimensions. The post circles are not visible on the surface. The wooden posts have long since rotted away, and their existence was revealed only by the dark stains in the soil that their decomposition left behind, detectable only through careful excavation and detailed analysis of the soil matrix. The recovery of these features required precisely the kind of systematic large-scale excavation that earlier work at the site had not conducted, and it transformed the understanding of the city's relationship to astronomical observation and to the ritual marking of time. That have been identified at several locations within the city, added another spatial element to the urban landscape of Cahokia. The alignment of these post circles with the sunrise on specific dates in the astronomical calendar suggests that they served as devices for marking the passage of the year, connecting the daily experience of the urban community to the larger cycles of astronomical time. Their position within the residential and ceremonial landscape of the city made them accessible features of everyday experience rather than remote astronomical observatories, and the knowledge they embodied, of when to plant, when to harvest, when to expect the floods, was knowledge that connected the community's survival to the movements of the sun. The daily life of a Cahokia resident was shaped by the rhythms of an agricultural economy built primarily around maize, and by the specific social and ritual obligations that life in a large, hierarchically organized community imposed. Maize agriculture was the foundation of Cahokia's economy and the source of the food surpluses that supported the city's large non-agricultural population. The cultivation of maize on the rich floodplain soils of the American bottom required the clearing of forest, the preparation and maintenance of fields, the management of the crop through the growing season, the harvest and processing of the grain, and its storage in conditions that would preserve it through the winter months and into the following year. The scale of maize production required to feed a population of 10 to 20,000 people was substantial, and the organization of agricultural labor across the city's territory was one of the central logistical challenges of Cahokia's political economy. The diet of Cahokia's residents was not, however, limited to maize. Botanical and faunal remains from excavations throughout the site document a broad dietary spectrum that included fish from the Mississippi and its tributaries, deer and other game from the surrounding forests and prairies, waterfowl from the wetlands, and a range of wild plant foods gathered from the diverse habitats of the American bottom. This dietary diversity reflects both the ecological productivity of the Cahokia landscape and the community's maintenance of multiple economic strategies alongside the dominant agricultural system. The social obligations of daily life at Cahokia were structured by the hierarchical organization of the community. The evidence for marked social inequality at the site, documented most clearly in the differential burial treatment of different members of the population, suggests a society in which access to resources, to ritual knowledge, and to the authority of the central institutions was strongly differentiated by status. The labor demands imposed by the construction and maintenance of the mound system, and by the ritual and ceremonial activities that the city's political culture required, fell on the population in ways that were almost certainly distributed unequally, with those at the bottom of the social hierarchy bearing a disproportionate share of the physical burden. The daily experience of living in a hierarchically organized community shaped daily life in ways that went beyond the formal obligations of labor and tribute. The social distance between the elite and the non-elite at Cahokia was expressed in material terms that would have been visible in everyday contexts, in the quality and quantity of food available to different households, in the access to the exotic goods that marked status and connection to the wider world, in the proximity to the ceremonial center and its activities. For the majority of the city's residents, the world of the elite, of the large buildings on the mound summit and the rich burials of the high-status dead, was visible but not accessible, a constant backdrop to a daily life organized around agricultural labor, craft production, and the maintenance of the household. The ceramic tradition of Cahokia and of the broader Mississippian culture produced vessels of distinctive form and decoration, whose distribution across the city and across the wider Mississippian world provides evidence for both the everyday domestic practices of the population and the long-distance exchange relationships that connected Cahokia to communities across a wide geographic area. The burial evidence from Cahokia is among the most revealing and most disturbing in North American archaeology. Mound 72, a small ridgetop mound located south of the Grand Plaza, has produced a series of burials that document the scale and the character of social inequality at Cahokia in stark physical terms. The most discussed burial in the mound is that of a man, probably a high-status individual of significant political or religious authority, who was interred on a bed of more than 20,000 marine shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird with outstretched wings. This beaded burial, as it is often called, is one of the most visually powerful archaeological finds in North American prehistory, and it speaks to a community capable of producing and deploying material wealth at a scale and with a symbolic sophistication that challenges the assumptions embedded in the standard narrative about ancient North America. Alongside and beneath the beaded burial were the remains of dozens of other individuals whose circumstances of death and interment were very different from those of the man on the shell bead platform. Groups of young women, many showing evidence of having been killed at the time of their burial, were interred in mass graves adjacent to the central burial. Other groups of individuals, some showing evidence of violent death, some apparently interred with little provision for an afterlife, were deposited in ways that suggest they were sacrificed or otherwise killed in connection with the burial ceremonies of the high-status individual. The evidence from Mound 72 is evidence of human sacrifice at Cahokia, of the killing of multiple individuals for ritual purposes associated with the burial of the elite. This practice, which has parallels in other early hierarchical societies across the world, speaks to the character of the political and religious culture of Cahokia in ways that complicate romantic narratives about pre-colonial North America. The city was not a peaceful community of agricultural village dwellers. It was a complex, stratified, politically aggressive society that used violence, including ritual violence, as an instrument of social control and political display. The broader burial record across the site confirms the picture of marked social inequality. The contrast between the Mound 72 burials, with their enormous investment of exotic materials and their evidence for human sacrifice, and the simple, goods-poor burials of the majority of the population, is one of the starkest illustrations of social stratification in pre-Columbian North American archaeology. The scale of the difference, not merely in the quantity of burial goods but in the very nature of the burial event, with the sacrifice of other people as an accompaniment to elite interment, speaks to a social order in which the lives of those at the bottom of the hierarchy were genuinely subject to the authority of those at the top in ways that were absolute rather than merely relative. Suggested by Mound 72. Elite burials with rich assemblages of exotic goods, copper ornaments, fine ceramics, and other prestige materials contrast sharply with the modest or absent grave goods of the majority of the population. The differential investment in burial treatment is one of the clearest archaeological indicators of a society in which the social hierarchy was deep and materially significant. The agricultural system that sustained Cahokia was more intensive and more geographically extensive than the site's immediate hinterland alone could have provided. The American Bottom, with its rich floodplain soils, was the primary agricultural zone, but the territory from which Cahokia drew its food supply almost certainly extended well beyond the floodplain itself. The upland zones above the river bluffs supported a different kind of agriculture, less reliant on the periodic flooding that enriched the bottomland soils but capable of cultivation even in years when flooding was excessive or inadequate. The combination of floodplain and upland agriculture gave the community a degree of buffering against the year-to-year variability in rainfall and flood patterns that was characteristic of the climate of the American Midwest. Maize was introduced to the eastern woodlands of North America from Mesoamerica along a series of exchange routes that connected the American Southwest and the Mississippi Valley to the agricultural civilizations of central Mexico, and its adoption in the American Bottom region in the centuries immediately preceding the rise of Cahokia was one of the preconditions for the development of the large, dense urban population that Cahokia represented. The productivity of maize cultivation on the American Bottom soils, combined with the other ecological resources of the region, created the food surplus that made the non-agricultural population of the city, the craftspeople, the ritual specialists, the political elite, and their dependents, economically possible. The management of the agricultural system across the territory tributary to Cahokia required coordination between the central authority of the city and the agricultural communities of the surrounding region. The flow of food into the city, the storage and redistribution of surpluses, and the mobilization of agricultural labor for the collective projects of mound construction and civic maintenance were all aspects of a political economy that extended well beyond the boundaries of the urban core. The ecological pressure of intensive maize agriculture on the soils and forests of the American Bottom is documented in the paleo-environmental record in ways that connect the human history of Cahokia to the broader environmental history of the region. Pollen cores from lake sediments near the site show a progressive decline in the forest pollen and an increase in the agricultural weed pollen that accompanies forest clearance and cultivation, beginning around the time of Cahokia's rapid urban transformation and continuing through the period of the city's peak occupation. The deforestation of the American Bottom bluffs, visible in the changing composition of the charcoal assemblages from Cahokia's hearth deposits, produced not only the agricultural land that the growing population required, but also the erosion and soil instability that would have contributed to the long-term degradation of the landscape, was one of the factors that contributed to the challenges the city faced in its later centuries. Deforestation for agricultural land and for fuel and construction timber, the progressive depletion of floodplain soil fertility under sustained cultivation, and the loss of wild game and other natural resources as the landscape was converted to agricultural use were all consequences of the city's growth that the community had to manage with increasing difficulty as the occupation continued. The symbolic and ritual culture of Cahokia is documented in the archaeological evidence in ways that suggest a community with a rich and well-developed cosmological tradition, though the specific content of that tradition must be inferred indirectly from the material record rather than from any surviving written account. The organization of the city's spatial layout around astronomical alignments is one of the clearest indicators of a cosmological framework that connected the built environment to the movements of celestial bodies. The Grand Plaza is oriented on a near-perfect north-south axis. The wood hinges are aligned with the sunrise on the equinoxes and solstices, marking the key transitions of the agricultural and ceremonial year. The placement of mounds in specific relationships to each other and to the cardinal directions suggests that the spatial organization of the city was understood as a map of a cosmological order, a physical representation of the relationship between the human community and the larger forces that govern the natural and supernatural worlds. The iconography of the artifacts recovered from Cahokia represents a visual tradition of considerable sophistication and symbolic density. The engraved shell and embossed copper objects that appear in the elite burial and midden contexts of the site carry images that connect the Cahokia tradition to the broader symbolic vocabulary of the southeastern ceremonial complex, a set of shared iconographic conventions that extended across much of the Mississippian world. The specific images, including the Birdman, the Chunky Player, the Weeping Eye motif, and various combinations of human, animal, and supernatural characteristics, appear at sites distributed across thousands of kilometers of the eastern half of North America, suggesting a shared symbolic tradition that was maintained across the geographic extent of the Mississippian cultural sphere through the movement of objects, people, and ideas, and from related Mississippian sites provides fragmentary but significant evidence for the content of the cosmological tradition. The Birdman motif, which appears on engraved shell and copper objects across the Mississippian world, has been interpreted as representing a specific category of supernatural being or a specific ritual practitioner who mediated between the human and the spirit worlds. The combination of human and raptor characteristics in this motif connects it to a widespread tradition in indigenous North American religious thought in which specific birds, particularly hawks and falcons, serve as messengers between the human world and the sky world above it. The three-tier cosmological model that appears to underlie much of Mississippian symbolic expression, a vertical arrangement of an upper sky world, a middle human world, and an underworld beneath the earth and waters, is consistent with the cosmological traditions documented among many of the indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands in the historical period. The alignment of the city's spatial organization with this three-tier model, with the elevated mounds representing the sky world and the plazas and low-lying areas representing the middle and lower realms, is one of the interpretive frameworks that archaeologists have applied to the spatial logic of Cahokia, though its specific application to this particular community must remain a matter of inference rather than certainty. The social organization of Cahokia was among the most hierarchical of any known pre-Columbian community north of Mexico, and the evidence for the concentration of political, religious, and economic authority in the hands of a small elite is substantial. The term that many archaeologists use to describe the political structure of Cahokia reflects the state of the theoretical debate more than it resolves it. The chiefdom model, as most archaeologists acknowledge, is a category with fuzzy boundaries that covers a wide range of specific social forms, and applying it to Cahokia raises as many questions as it answers. The specific way in which authority was legitimized and exercised at Cahokia, the relationship between political and religious authority, the mechanisms for succession and for the resolution of disputes within the elite, the nature of the obligations that ordinary residents owed to the political center. These are all questions that the label chiefdom does not answer and that the archaeological evidence addresses only partially. And similar Mississippian centers is chiefdom, a category that describes a form of social organization intermediate between the relatively egalitarian tribal societies of many hunter-gatherer and small-scale agricultural communities and the full state-level societies of complex civilizations like those of Mesoamerica or the ancient Near East. Chiefdoms are characterized by hereditary social ranking, the concentration of decision-making authority in the hands of a chief and their close associates, and the use of that authority to organize collective labor, manage redistribution, and direct warfare and ritual activity. The evidence from Cahokia is consistent with this general model, though the specific institutional form of Cahokia's political organization is a matter of ongoing debate. The scale and the elaborateness of the central mound complex, and the evidence for the consumption of labor and material resources in the service of the elite that is visible in the burial record and in the construction sequence of the major mounds, speak to a concentration of authority capable of mobilizing and directing the work of large numbers of people over extended periods. Whatever the specific institutional form of that authority, it was real, it was durable across several generations, and it was capable of sustaining a city of this scale and complexity for more than a century at its height. The relationship between the central authority of the city and the outlying communities of the broader Cahokia territory is another dimension of the social organization that the evidence addresses only partially. The presence of Cahokia-style ceramics, mound construction, and symbolic iconography at sites across a wide area of the eastern woodlands suggests that the city's political and cultural influence extended well beyond its immediate territory, but the specific mechanisms through which that influence operated, whether through tribute relationships, trade networks, political alliance, or the prestige of the city's ceremonial center, are not clearly visible in the archaeological record. The population of the city, and its relationship to the surrounding rural communities, is another area of ongoing research and debate. The peak population estimates for Cahokia range considerably across different researchers and different methodological approaches, and the question of whether the city's population was sustained primarily by natural increase within the urban area or by continuous in-migration from the surrounding region is one that isotopic analysis of skeletal remains is beginning to address. The exchange networks that connected Cahokia to the wider Mississippian world and to more distant regions of North America were extensive and materially significant. The presence of copper objects at Cahokia and at other Mississippian sites along the Mississippi Valley connects the city to the copper-producing regions of the Great Lakes, particularly the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan, where native copper of unusual purity was accessible at or near the surface. The transport of copper from the Great Lakes to Cahokia, a distance of several hundred kilometers, was conducted along river routes that constituted the highways of the eastern woodlands, and the concentration of copper objects at high-status burial and midden contexts at Cahokia speaks to the importance of copper as a prestige material within the Mississippian symbolic economy. Marine shell, obtained from the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic seaboard, appears in quantity at Cahokia in contexts that range from the spectacular beaded burial of Mound 72 to the more modest shell ornaments found in residential contexts across the site. The movement of marine shell from its coastal sources to the inland city of Cahokia required the maintenance of exchange relationships across a very large geographic area, connecting the communities of the Gulf Coast, the Mid-South, and the Mississippi Valley in a network of material exchange that also, presumably, carried ideas, ritual knowledge, and political relationships along with the physical goods. Chert, a flint-like stone used for the production of knapp tools, was traded across the Cahokia region from specific high-quality sources in Missouri and southern Illinois, and the distribution of different chert types across the site provides evidence for the specific routes and relationships through which lithic materials moved in and around the city. The presence of non-local chert types in high quantities suggests that some of the knapped stone tool production at Cahokia was using specifically sourced material brought to the city from some distance rather than simply using locally available stone. The exchange network that connected Cahokia to its broader world was not simply a commercial system. The movement of specific categories of goods, particularly copper and marine shell, through the Mississippian exchange network was embedded in a system of social and political relationships that gave the circulation of these materials its significance. Copper was not merely a beautiful metal. It was a material whose color, its reddish brilliance, was associated in the symbolic vocabulary of the Mississippian world with the sun and with the supernatural power of the sky world. Possessing copper was possessing a form of cosmological power, and the concentration of copper in the high-status burial contexts of Cahokia speaks to the ways in which the elite of the city managed and displayed their claims to authority through the control of materially significant prestige goods. It was a social and political system in which the movement of goods was embedded in relationships of alliance, obligation, and prestige that structured the political landscape of the Mississippian world. The exotic materials that ended up in the elite burials of Cahokia were not merely beautiful objects. They were the material embodiment of relationships between the Cahokia elite and the elites of distant communities, relationships that were maintained and displayed through the circulation of valued materials and that constituted an important part of the social infrastructure of the Mississippian political world. The central mystery of Cahokia is why it rose so rapidly, flourished so briefly, and declined so completely. The archaeological record suggests that the transformation of the site from a smaller settlement into the large urban center that Cahokia became happened very quickly in historical terms, perhaps within a generation or two around 1050 CE. The rapid construction of Monk's Mound and the Grand Plaza, the laying out of the central precinct with its palisade and its organized mound groups, and the apparently sudden increase in population that the site experienced in this period all speak to a transformation that was fast by any standard of pre-industrial urban development. What drove this rapid transformation is a question that the evidence addresses only indirectly. One influential hypothesis focuses on an unusual astronomical event. The supernova that created what we now call the Crab Nebula was visible in the night sky in 1054 CE, 3 to 4 years after the apparent beginning of the Cahokia transformation, and it has been proposed that this spectacular celestial event, which would have been visible as a bright star in the daytime sky for several weeks, may have provided the cosmological impetus for a dramatic reconfiguration of the political and religious landscape of the American bottom, with the builders of the mounds positioning their city as the earthly counterpart of a supernatural event of obvious significance. This hypothesis is speculative and cannot be directly tested from the archaeological evidence. But it speaks to the broader interpretive challenge of Cahokia, which is that the city's rapid rise and its subsequent decline appear to be out of proportion to the gradual environmental and demographic changes that most processual explanations of urban development rely upon. Something happened around 1050 CE that concentrated the population and the political authority of the American bottom in one place with unusual speed and unusual intensity. One possibility that researchers have considered is that Cahokia's rapid rise was connected to the emergence of a specific charismatic political religious leader whose authority was powerful enough to attract followers from across a wide region and to organize them into the collective project of building the city. If such a figure existed, their influence would have been grounded in a claim to special cosmological knowledge or special supernatural sanction, consistent with the astronomical orientation of the city's spatial program and with the evidence for the close integration of political and religious authority in the Mississippian tradition. In one place with unusual speed and unusual intensity, and understanding what that something was remains one of the central unsolved problems of Cahokia archaeology. The woodhenge alignments and the astronomical orientation of the city's spatial layout suggest that the political authority of Cahokia's ruling elite was grounded in a claim to special knowledge of, or special relationship to, the cosmic order. If the rapid rise of Cahokia was connected to a claim of this kind, and if that claim was validated by specific astronomical events or by the visible success of the city's agricultural and political system, then the decline of the city might be connected to the failure of that claim. to the emergence of circumstances that the ruling elite could no longer manage within the framework of their cosmological authority. The decline of Cahokia was gradual by comparison with its rise, but it was nonetheless substantial and ultimately complete. The peak of Cahokia's occupation, in terms of population density, mound construction activity, and the elaborateness of the material culture recovered from excavation, appears to have occurred in the 12th century CE. After this peak, the archaeological evidence suggests a community that was contracting rather than growing. The density of occupation in the outlying residential areas of the city decreases, the construction of new mounds slows and eventually ceases, and the material culture of the later occupation shows a reduction in the quantity and quality of the exotic goods that had been characteristic of the city's more prosperous period. By the end of the 13th century, the main occupation of the central precinct was effectively over, and by the 14th century the city as a major urban center had ceased to function. The site was not entirely abandoned. Small-scale occupation of parts of the site continued for some time after the urban center collapsed, and there is evidence for continued use of certain mound locations as ceremonial places even after the dense residential occupation had ended. But the city of Cahokia, in the sense of a large, hierarchically organized urban community with a functioning political and ceremonial center, was over by approximately 1350 CE, more than a century before the first European contact with the North American continent. The causes of the decline are multiple and interacting. Environmental stress, including the deforestation of the surrounding landscape and the progressive degradation of the agricultural soils under intensive cultivation, reduced the carrying capacity of the Cahokia territory over the decades of the city's occupation. Climate variability, including a sequence of droughts that affected maize production in the Mississippi Valley in the 13th century, may have stressed the food supply in ways that the city's political and redistributive systems were unable to adequately manage. Social tensions, visible in the evidence for increasing violence in the skeletal population and in the repeated rebuilding of the palisade that enclosed the central precinct, may have undermined the social cohesion that the city's hierarchical political culture required. The population that dispersed from Cahokia at the end of its occupation did not vanish. The Mississippian cultural tradition continued at other centers across the eastern woodlands, and the political and ceremonial knowledge that had been concentrated at Cahokia was carried by the dispersing population to new communities where it continued to shape the social and symbolic landscape. The great mound centers that flourished in the centuries after Cahokia's decline, including Moundville in Alabama and the Etowah site in Georgia, represent the continuation of the Mississippian tradition in a form that owed something, directly or indirectly, to the legacy of the city that had defined the tradition at its height. The descendants of the Cahokia community contributed to the cultures of the indigenous peoples of the Mississippi Valley and the broader eastern woodlands, and the Mississippian cultural tradition continued in various forms at other centers across the region for several centuries after the abandonment of the great city on the American bottom. The relationship between Cahokia and the broader Mississippian world is one of the most actively debated questions in the archaeology of pre-Columbian North America. The Mississippian cultural tradition, of which Cahokia was the largest and most complex expression, was a genuinely widespread phenomenon, and its characteristic features, platform mound construction, maize agriculture, complex social hierarchies, and a shared iconographic tradition sometimes called the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, appear at sites distributed across an area of roughly 2 million square kilometers of the eastern half of the North American continent. Understanding the relationship between Cahokia and this broader tradition, whether the city was the source from which Mississippian culture spread, a particularly prominent node in a pre-existing regional network, or a local development that happened to coincide with similar developments elsewhere, is a question that the evidence does not definitively resolve. The hypothesis that Cahokia was a major center of cultural influence that actively spread Mississippian practices across a wide area is supported by the widespread distribution of Cahokia-style ceramics, copper objects, and other material culture at sites across the Mississippian world. The presence of these Cahokia-specific materials at distant sites suggests either that Cahokia was exporting its products across a large territory or that it was serving as a model that other communities were actively emulating. In either case, the cultural influence of the city on its wider world appears to have been substantial. The comparison with contemporary Mesoamerican urban centers is illuminating. The great cities of post-classic Mesoamerica, including Tula in central Mexico and Chichen Itza in the Yucatan, were developing in the same period as Cahokia, and the question of whether there were direct connections between the civilizations of Mesoamerica and the Mississippian tradition of the eastern woodlands is one that has been debated since the 19th century. The current consensus among archaeologists is that the similarities between Mississippian and Mesoamerican cultural practices, including platform mound construction, the importance of maize agriculture, and certain iconographic parallels, are the result of independent development from shared general conditions rather than direct contact, though the possibility of indirect influence transmitted through the long-distance exchange networks that connected the American Southwest to both regions is acknowledged as a genuine possibility. The comparison between Cahokia and the urban centers of the contemporary Old World is one that the evidence invites, but that requires care. The city at its peak was genuinely large by the standards of pre-industrial urban settlements, and its mound complex represents a monumental investment comparable in ambition, if not in specific form, to the great construction projects of medieval Europe or the ancient Near East. The differences are as significant as the similarities. Cahokia built in earth rather than stone, organized its space around mounds and plazas rather than cathedrals and market squares, and expressed its cosmological tradition through astronomical alignment and symbolic iconography rather than through figurative religious art and architecture in the Western sense. But the ambition, the organizational capacity, and the cultural investment that both traditions represent are of the same order of magnitude. The indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands, whose oral traditions were recorded by European observers in the historical period, retained knowledge of the mounds as ancestral monuments, and the relationship between the historical indigenous nations of the region and the builders of the Mississippian sites is a subject of ongoing research through the combination of archaeological, genetic, and ethno-historical methods. What makes Cahokia different from other ancient places is not simply its size or its age, but the specific combination of features that it presents and what that combination implies about the range of social complexity that was possible in pre-Columbian North America. The persistence of the mound builder myth in popular culture, and the continuing underrepresentation of Cahokia in the standard narratives of world history and ancient civilization, reflect a failure of cultural acknowledgement that has consequences beyond the merely scholarly. Cahokia is not a footnote or an anomaly. It was a city, by any reasonable definition of the term, that was contemporary with the medieval cities of Europe, that had a population comparable in scale to many of the major cities of the 11th century world, and that represented a level of social complexity, political organization, and monumental ambition that belongs in any honest account of what human beings were doing in the world during the period we call the Middle Ages. The fact that Cahokia is not widely known, that it appears in few secondary school history curricula and in few popular accounts of the ancient world, is a form of historical erasure that the archaeological evidence does not support. The city was real. It was large. It was architecturally ambitious. It was socially complex. It was connected to a wide world of exchange and influence. And it has been systematically undervalued in the broader cultural narrative about human achievement and human history. The implications of taking Cahokia seriously extend to how we think about the indigenous peoples of North America more broadly. If Cahokia is evidence that urban complexity, hierarchical political organization, monumental architecture, and long-distance exchange networks were all present in pre-Columbian North America north of Mexico, then the standard narrative that treats European colonization as the introduction of civilization to a wilderness is not merely incomplete. It is wrong. in ways that matter for how we understand the history of the continent and the nature of what was lost when the indigenous civilizations of North America were disrupted and destroyed by the colonial process. The argument is not that pre-Columbian North America was uniformly complex or uniformly urban. It is the more modest and more defensible claim that its range of social forms was wider than the standard narrative allows, that urban complexity existed in specific times and places within it, and that the specific case of Cahokia is evidence of that complexity that belongs in any honest account of the human past. The city existed. It was large. It was sophisticated. It built things that are still standing after 1,000 years. These are facts that deserve to be known. The tensions and contradictions within Cahokia's social structure are visible in the archaeological evidence in ways that complicate any simple narrative of urban success. The evidence for violence in the Cahokia skeletal population increases in the later periods of the city's occupation in ways that are consistent with a community under increasing stress, but that also need to be placed in the broader context of violence and conflict in Mississippian societies more generally. The Mississippian world was not a peaceful world. The evidence for warfare, raiding, and the taking of captives is present throughout the Mississippian archaeological record, and the physical evidence of trauma in the Cahokia skeletal population reflects both the specific stresses of the city's later period and the more general context of a regional political landscape in which violence was a normal feature of intercommunity relations. Of the city's occupation, healed and unhealed fractures, embedded projectile points, and the signs of interpersonal combat become more frequent in the skeletal assemblages from the 13th century than they were in the earlier occupation. This pattern is consistent with a community under increasing stress, in which the social mechanisms that maintained order in the earlier period were becoming less effective, and in which violence was becoming a more common feature of daily life. The repeated rebuilding of the palisade that enclosed the central precinct is another indicator of tension within or around the city. A palisade is a barrier, and its repeated reconstruction suggests a community that felt, or was, under threat, and that considered the physical separation of the central precinct from the surrounding city an important feature of its security or its ceremonial distinctiveness. Whether the threat was internal, from the city's own population, or external, from communities outside the city's territory, is difficult to determine from the architectural evidence alone. The evidence for population decline in the outlying residential areas of the city, which begins before the final abandonment of the central precinct, suggests that the community was losing population before the political center collapsed. People were leaving. The reasons they were leaving are not directly accessible from the archaeological record, but the combination of environmental stress, food supply challenges, social inequality, and political tension that the evidence documents collectively suggests a community in which the conditions of daily life were becoming progressively less comfortable and the future less secure. The specific trajectory of Cahokia's decline, from its peak in the 12th century through the progressive contraction of the 13th century to the final abandonment of the central precinct in the 14th, suggests a community that was managing a long, slow deterioration rather than experiencing a sudden catastrophe. The political culture of the city, organized around the authority of an elite whose claims to supernatural sanction were embedded in the spatial and ritual program of the mound complex, may have been particularly vulnerable to the slow erosion of confidence that a long period of declining conditions can produce, as the evidence for the elite's ability to deliver on its promises of abundance and protection became progressively harder to maintain. The question of what became of the people of Cahokia after the abandonment of the city is one that connects the ancient archaeology of the site to the living communities of indigenous North America. The genetic and cultural connections between the builders of Cahokia and the historical indigenous nations of the eastern woodlands are approached with increasing methodological sophistication through the combination of ancient DNA analysis, bioarchaeological study, and careful engagement with the oral traditions and cultural knowledge of the indigenous nations themselves. The ancient DNA research that has been conducted at Cahokia and at other Mississippian sites is beginning to produce evidence for the specific genetic relationships between the city's population and the populations of surrounding communities, evidence that complements and in some cases complicates the picture that material culture analysis alone had produced. Of the eastern woodlands are a subject of ongoing research, and the picture that is emerging is more complex and more continuous than earlier accounts suggested. The dispersal of the Cahokia population at the end of the city's occupation contributed to the formation of the cultural landscape that European colonizers encountered in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the communities they met were not the same communities that had inhabited Cahokia, but they were not entirely different either. The cultural traditions of the Mississippian world, including elements of ceremonial practice, agricultural knowledge, and social organization, persisted in various transformed forms in the communities that descended from and succeeded the Cahokia-centered polity. Several of the indigenous nations that inhabited the Mississippi Valley and the surrounding regions at the time of European contact are believed by archaeologists and by the nations themselves to have ancestral connections to the Mississippian culture. The Osage, the Quapaw, the Omaha, and other Siouan-speaking peoples of the central and northern plains, as well as various Algonquian and Muskogee-speaking communities of the eastern woodlands and the Gulf Coast, have been proposed as potential descendants of the dispersed Cahokia population, though the specific connections are difficult to trace with certainty through the disruptive centuries of European contact. The Cahokia Mound State Historic Site today is the location of an ongoing effort to connect the archaeological evidence of the ancient city with the living communities whose ancestral connections to the site are recognized, though imperfectly documented. The consultation with indigenous nations that federal and state law requires for archaeological work at ancestral sites has brought new perspectives to the interpretation of the evidence from Cahokia, and the integration of indigenous oral traditions and cultural knowledge into the scholarly understanding of the site is an ongoing and productive process that is changing how researchers approach the questions that the site raises. The continued presence of the mounds themselves in the modern landscape, many of them incorporated into a state historic site and protected by conservation measures, is a form of material continuity that spans the centuries between the ancient city and the contemporary communities that maintain connections to it. What modern archaeology has learned about Cahokia in the past half-century represents a significant transformation in the understanding of pre-Columbian North America. The application of radiocarbon dating to the construction sequences of the mounds has established a chronology for the city's development that is now detailed enough to trace the major phases of its rise and decline. The interpretation of this chronology in relation to the paleo-environmental record has allowed researchers to correlate the phases of the city's development with specific environmental changes, including the drought episodes of the 13th century that appear in the isotopic and pollen records of the region. These correlations are not sufficient to establish simple causal relationships between environmental change and urban decline, but they are informative about the environmental context within which the political and social changes of Cahokia's later period were occurring. Has established a chronology for the city's development that is now detailed enough to trace the major phases of its rise and decline with reasonable confidence. The dating evidence shows that the rapid urban transformation that created Cahokia in its most elaborate form occurred within a relatively short period around the mid-11th century. The precision of the radiocarbon dating that supports this chronology has improved significantly in recent decades as the calibration of the radiocarbon timescale has been refined and as Bayesian statistical methods have been applied to the analysis of large data sets of dates from stratified contexts across the site. The resulting chronology is now detailed enough to distinguish between construction phases that were separated by decades rather than centuries, and this resolution has transformed the understanding of the pace and sequence of the city's development in ways that earlier research could not achieve. In its most elaborate form occurred within a relatively short period around the mid-11th century, and that the city reached its peak in the 12th century before beginning the long decline that ended in abandonment by the mid-14th century. Bioarchaeological analysis of the skeletal remains from the site has provided information about the health, diet, activity patterns, and geographic origins of the city's population that was not accessible to earlier generations of researchers. The analysis of stable isotopes in the bones and teeth of Cahokia residents, which can reveal where individuals grew up and what they ate throughout their lives, has shown that the city attracted migrants from a wide geographic area, consistent with the interpretation of Cahokia as a major regional center that drew people from across the Mississippian world. The dietary evidence confirms the heavy reliance on maize that the botanical record suggested, and also documents the variation in dietary quality between different segments of the population, with higher status individuals showing evidence of better and more varied nutrition than those at the lower end of the social hierarchy. The mapping of the full extent of the city using a combination of aerial photography, ground-penetrating radar, and LiDAR analysis has revealed the locations of features that are not visible on the surface, including the post holes of the wood henges, the outlines of buildings and plazas in areas not yet excavated, and the traces of the wooden palisade in locations where it had previously been unknown. The digital reconstruction of the ancient urban landscape that these methods are producing is considerably more complete and more detailed than what earlier survey methods could provide. The study of the city's agricultural hinterland, using soil analysis, pollen cores from local lake sediments, and the analysis of botanical remains from excavated contexts across the region, is documenting the environmental changes that accompanied the city's growth and decline in ways that connect the human history of the site to the broader environmental history of the American bottom. The picture that emerges is of a community that significantly altered its landscape over the course of its occupation, and that was, by the end of that occupation, living in an environment that it had substantially degraded. What remains uncertain about Cahokia is considerable, and some of the most important questions may prove resistant to the methods currently available for answering them. The political organization of the city, and the specific institutional form of the authority that directed the construction of the mounds and the management of the city's resources, is documented in the spatial and material evidence but not in any written account. The interpretations of that evidence range from models of a powerful paramount chief whose authority was both political and cosmological, to models of a more collegial or competitive political structure in which different elite lineages negotiated for dominance, to models that emphasize the role of religious specialists and ceremonial authority rather than secular political power. The evidence does not conclusively favor any single model over the others. The specific content of the religious and cosmological tradition that gave Cahokia's spatial organization its meaning is one of the questions that the site raises most insistently and answers least completely. The material evidence of the site, its mound alignments, its wood henges, its symbolic iconography, can be placed within interpretive frameworks drawn from the cosmological traditions of the historical indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands. But this placement requires the assumption that the traditions of the 16th and 17th centuries preserve meaningful continuity with the practices of the 11th and 12th. That assumption is reasonable but not demonstrable, and the interpretations built on it must be held with appropriate epistemic humility. That gave Cahokia's spatial organization its meaning is accessible only through inference and analogy. The material evidence of the wood henges, the mound alignments, and the symbolic iconography of the artifacts can be placed within the broader framework of the cosmological traditions documented among the historical indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands, but the specific beliefs and practices of the Cahokia community are not directly recoverable from the physical record. The gap between what the evidence shows was done and what the people who did it thought and believed is one that archaeology alone cannot bridge. The reasons for the rapid rise of Cahokia around 1050 CE remain imperfectly understood. The coincidence of the city's transformation with the supernova of 1054 CE is intriguing but not demonstrably causal. The combination of environmental, demographic, and political factors that produced the sudden concentration of population and authority at the American bottom in the mid-11th century is a question that the available evidence can illuminate but not definitively answer. The connections between Cahokia and the historical indigenous nations that are its cultural descendants are a matter not only of scholarly research but of legal, political, and ethical importance. Federal legislation in the United States requires that the descendants of the people whose remains are held in museum collections and whose ancestral sites are the subject of archaeological investigation be consulted in decisions about that research and about the disposition of ancestral remains and sacred objects. The implementation of this requirement at Cahokia has brought indigenous nations into the management and interpretation of the site in ways that have enriched both the scholarly understanding of the evidence and the presentation of that evidence to the public. That its cultural descendants are a matter of ongoing research and ongoing negotiation between the archaeological and indigenous communities, and the picture will continue to develop as new methods, new evidence, and new collaborative frameworks are brought to bear on the questions that the site raises. Cahokia changes how we think about pre-Columbian North America in ways that are both specific and fundamental. The specific change is to the understanding of what ancient North America contained. Cahokia is not the only Mississippian site that challenges the standard narrative, but it is the most dramatic. The scale of Monk's Mound, the elaborateness of the spatial organization of the central precinct, the richness of the exchange goods in the elite burial contexts, and the evidence for a population of tens of thousands of people all combine to make Cahokia an argument that is difficult to ignore and impossible to dismiss as a minor exception to a generally valid generalization. It is a major counterexample, and it deserves to be treated as such. The persistence of narratives that treat the pre-Columbian history of North America north of Mexico as essentially prehistoric has been challenged by Cahokia and by the broader evidence of Mississippian urbanism for decades, but the challenge has not fully penetrated the popular consciousness or the educational curricula that shape how most people understand the human history of the North American continent. The reasons for this resistance are partly scholarly, having to do with the specific ways that pre-Columbian North America has been framed within the academic disciplines of archaeology and history. But they are also cultural and political, having to do with the narratives that the settler colonial societies of North America have needed to tell about themselves and about the land they occupy. Cahokia occupied land that is now part of the metropolitan area of St. Louis, one of the largest cities in the American Midwest. The juxtaposition of the ancient mounds and the modern cityscape is one of the more striking features of the site's current situation, and it has a resonance that goes beyond the merely picturesque. The city that replaced Cahokia on the American bottom did so without any acknowledgement of what had been there before, and the recovery of that acknowledgement, through the designation of the Cahokia Mound State Historic Site and the ongoing archaeological research that has expanded the understanding of the ancient city, is an ongoing project that is still far from complete. As a history of hunter-gatherers and small-scale agricultural communities that had not yet achieved the complexity and the monumental ambition of the great civilizations of Mesoamerica and South America, has been a feature of popular historical consciousness and of many educational curricula for a very long time. Cahokia is evidence against this narrative, not as a marginal exception but as a significant counterexample that changes the terms of the discussion. A city of potentially 10 to 20,000 people, built on the American bottom in the 11th century CE, is not a marginal exception to the story of North American prehistory. It is among the larger urban centers of its era, though precise comparisons with contemporary cities in other parts of the world are difficult. It is contemporary with the great medieval cities of Europe. It was constructing monumental earthworks of a scale that has no parallel north of Mexico and few parallels anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas. And it was doing all of this without the benefit of metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, and without the draft animals that were essential to the construction projects of the Old World civilizations that are its rough contemporaries. The fundamental change that Cahokia demands is to the concept of civilization itself, and to the assumption that the specific institutional forms that civilization took in the Old World, literacy, metallurgy, wheeled transport, the domestication of large draft animals, are necessary conditions for social complexity, monumental construction, and urban life. Cahokia achieved urban complexity, monumental construction, long-distance exchange, and sophisticated cosmological expression without any of these old-world technologies. The city is evidence that the capacity for complex social organization and monumental achievement is more widely distributed across human communities and less dependent on specific technological prerequisites than the standard accounts of civilization have tended to assume. This evidence does not diminish the achievements of the old-world civilizations. It expands the record of what human beings have been capable of across different contexts and with different resources, and it requires that any honest account of human achievement acknowledge the full range of that record rather than only the portions of it that are most familiar. The people of Cahokia were fully human in every sense that the phrase implies, and the evidence they left behind is a record of lives lived in a specific place under specific conditions that the archaeology is slowly recovering. The physical evidence of Cahokia's residents is, in the end, what the archaeology of the site is most fundamentally about. Not the theoretical models of social complexity, not the debates about the mound builder myth, not the comparisons with Mesoamerican or Old World urban forms, but the specific, physical record of the specific people who lived in this specific place and whose bones and tools and ceramics and earthworks are still in the ground beneath the American bottom. The combination of rigor and humility that good archaeology requires, the commitment to saying accurately what the evidence shows and honestly what it does not show, is the method through which the voices of those people, fragmentary and mediated as they necessarily are, can be most faithfully recovered. Their bones in the ground, their tools in the midden deposits, their ceramics in the household contexts, their exchange goods in the burial assemblages, constitutes a form of biography, incomplete and mediated by the specific processes of preservation and excavation, but genuinely informative about the people who produced it. The bioarchaeological analysis of the skeletal population has given researchers a detailed picture of the health burdens that the city's inhabitants carried, of the physical demands that daily life imposed on their bodies, and of the patterns of diet and activity that differentiated the lives of the wealthy and well-nourished elite from those of the people who performed the agricultural and construction labor that sustained the city. The evidence for migration in the isotopic signatures of the population, which shows that a significant proportion of the residents of Cahokia grew up elsewhere before coming to the city, speaks to lives of movement and choice as well as of constraint. People came to Cahokia, from considerable distances in some cases, and the reasons that brought them there were presumably varied. The economic opportunities of a large trading center, the ceremonial draw of a major ritual site, the political attraction of a powerful political center, the kinship obligations that connected individuals to households that had established themselves in the city. Whatever the specific reasons, the city was a place that people chose to come to as well as a place that people were born into. The mounds that dominate the landscape of Cahokia today are the most direct connection to the people who built them. Monk's Mound, in particular, carries the labor of many generations in its earth. The specific physical effort of the workers who carried basketfuls of soil from the borrow pits to the growing platform, repeated across years and decades and generations, accumulated into the largest earthwork in North America. There are no names attached to this work, no records of the individuals who performed it. But the work was performed by specific people with specific bodies and specific lives, and what they built is still there. The central image of Cahokia, the image that the evidence keeps returning to, is the image of Monk's Mound rising from the flat American bottom. 30 meters high, 300 meters long, 100 meters wide at the summit. Built by hand, without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals, one basketful of earth at a time, by workers whose names we do not know and whose lives we can only partially reconstruct from the bones and the artifacts they left in the ground. The mound has been there for nearly 1,000 years. It was already old when Columbus crossed the Atlantic. It was already old when the first European traders reached the Mississippi Valley. It was already old, and the city that had created it was already gone, when the colonial narratives that have shaped our understanding of North American history were first being written. The view from the summit of Monk's Mound on a clear day takes in the full extent of the American bottom, the wide flat floodplain that was once the territory of the largest city north of Mexico, the Mississippi visible in the distance to the west, the bluffs rising behind you to the east, the landscape of the modern city of St. Louis and East St. Louis spreading across the bottomland that was once the territory of Cahokia. The mounds that once organized this landscape are still there, many of them, though reduced by agriculture and by the construction of roads and buildings in the modern period. From the summit of Monk's Mound, on a clear day, you can see several dozen of the subsidiary mounds, their low profiles just distinguishable from the flatness of the surrounding plain. The people who stood on this summit 1,000 years ago looked out over a different landscape, a city of wooden buildings and earthen platforms, organized around plazas and palisades, animated by the activities of tens of thousands of people engaged in the full range of activities that urban life involves. They stood at the center of the largest political and ceremonial complex in pre-Columbian North America north of Mexico, in a city that was, by the standards of its time, genuinely world-class in its scale and its ambition. That city is gone. The memory of it, in the cultural consciousness of the broader society, is fragmentary at best. But the earth that its builders moved is still there, shaped into the forms that expressed their cosmological vision, and it is evidence of something that deserves to be remembered. The people who built Monk's Mound were doing something that mattered to them deeply enough to organize the labor of thousands of people across multiple generations in its service. Whatever the specific cosmological and political content of that project, the commitment behind it was genuine, and the result of that commitment is still visible in the earth of the American bottom, in the largest earthwork in pre-Columbian North America, still standing after 1,000 years of rain and wind and the changes of the world around it. The mounds at Cahokia are among the most significant and least celebrated archaeological monuments in the Western Hemisphere. The site is a UNESCO World Heritage Property, and its designation in 1982 reflects an international recognition of its significance that has not always been matched by the attention it receives in the national narratives of the United States. The paradox of Cahokia's situation, widely recognized among archaeologists and scholars of pre-Columbian North America as one of the most significant archaeological sites in the Western Hemisphere, while remaining largely unknown to the general public and underrepresented in the standard accounts of world history, is one that researchers and advocates have been working to address for decades. The progress has been real but incomplete. Designated in 1982, one of only 24 sites in the United States to hold this status, a recognition of its global significance as evidence of the pre-Columbian civilizations of North America. It is also an Illinois State Historic Site, maintained by the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency, and it is open to the public as a park and museum complex that receives several 100,000 visitors per year. The visitor center at the site, which was substantially rebuilt and expanded in recent decades, provides an introduction to the history and archaeology of the city that gives most visitors their first serious encounter with a civilization that the standard narratives of American history have largely overlooked. The conservation challenges at the site are significant. The earthen mounds are vulnerable to erosion by rain and to the pressure of visitor traffic, and the management of large numbers of visitors on and around the mounds requires a constant balance between the desire to provide meaningful access to the site and the need to protect the archaeological deposits from damage. The areas of the site that have been excavated are also vulnerable to the weathering and biological growth that exposure to the atmosphere introduces, and the management of these areas requires ongoing conservation work that is both labor-intensive and technically demanding. The broader landscape of Cahokia, outside the boundaries of the State Historic Site, has been significantly altered by the development of the modern metropolitan area of St. Louis, which extends across much of the American bottom. Many of the subsidiary mounds that once organized the residential and ceremonial landscape of the ancient city have been destroyed or damaged by construction, agriculture, and other land uses over the past 2 centuries. The contrast between the protected core of the site and the developed landscape that surrounds it is a vivid illustration of the challenges of preserving pre-Columbian heritage in a modern urban context. The ongoing archaeological research at the site, conducted by universities, government agencies, and independent researchers, continues to produce new evidence that refines and in some cases revises the understanding of what Cahokia was. The questions that the site raises about the nature of pre-Columbian civilization, about the organizational capacity of indigenous North American societies, and about the specific history of this specific place and its specific people, are questions that deserve to be asked more widely and answered more carefully than the current state of public knowledge about the site would suggest. The American bottom at dusk has a particular quality of light. The flat floodplain catches the late sun at a low angle, and the shadows of the mounds stretch long across the ground, making their shapes more visible than they are in the direct overhead light of midday. Monk's Mound is especially clear in this light. The massive earthen platform, 30 meters of hand-carried soil, rises against the western sky in a profile that is unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably the work of human hands with a specific vision of what they were building and why. 1,000 years ago, this light would have fallen on a city that its builders and inhabitants knew as their home, whose mounds and plazas and wooden buildings were the familiar landscape of their daily lives, whose organization and meaning they understood in ways that we are still working to recover. The familiarity of that landscape to its inhabitants is one of the things that is hardest to hold in mind when looking at what remains of it now. The mounds look ancient to us. To the people who lived among them, they were simply there, part of the world they had grown up in, as ordinary and as extraordinary as the world always is to the people who inhabit it. On wooden buildings and palisades, on people moving through the plazas, on the smoke from cooking fires, on the sound of a community of tens of thousands going about the activities that sustained its life. The wood henges would have been standing in this light, their posts marking the angle of the sunset at specific times of year, their alignments connecting the daily experience of the community to the longer cycles of the astronomical calendar. The elite of the city would have been watching this light from the summit of Monk's Mound, from the elevated platform that made their authority visible to the whole community below. The city is gone now. The wooden buildings decayed long ago. The palisade is invisible except as a pattern of post holes in the ground, detectable only by careful excavation and careful analysis. The people who lived and worked and died here are present only in the bones preserved in the burial contexts and in the artifacts scattered through the occupation deposits. The light is the same light. What Cahokia represents is not a mystery, not a lost civilization in the romantic sense of a world that vanished without explanation. It is something at once more simple and more significant, evidence of what human beings built in this specific place at this specific time, evidence that the pre-Columbian history of North America was more complex, more ambitious, and more worthy of serious attention than the standard narratives have typically acknowledged. The mounds are still here. The evidence is still being recovered. The story of Cahokia is not finished. If this documentary kept you company through the night, there is more waiting for you. Choose the next film on screen, and let the story keep unfolding.